Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Cade, and once again, I am joined by a returning guest, my friend Max. And for this episode, we are going to be talking about storytelling in movies and video games. All right, hey Max, thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thank you for having me back on again.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when it comes to storytelling in movies versus video games, I know what some of your favorite movies are because we've covered it before. Jurassic Park, Into the Spider-Verse, Monty Python, and the Holy Grail. But when it comes to video games, specifically narrative-based games, what are some of your favorite games of all time?
Oh, favorite games of all time? Oh boy. Well, I Cyberpunk 2077, very new, very recent, came out in 2020, has climbed that list for me, especially with the Phantom Liberty DLC, which just has a lot of really excellent storytelling and acting, and you have Idris Elba in that story, and you also have Keanu Reeves in the main story. I love that story mainly because of how gritty cyberpunk story of living in Night City and how everyone wants to aspire to become a legend in that city, how it built itself up with a giant heist in the beginning that goes terrible, and then throughout the story it's kind of avenging your fallen friend. And then we have a game like the Mass Effect trilogy, which is just immaculate storytelling from the get-go. You have a mysterious unknown alien ship destroy a human colony, you get involved with it, you touch this alien artifact you shouldn't touch, and then all of a sudden you're involved in the not only saving humanity, saving the galaxy, every alien race. And by the time it culminates in the third game, it is just kind of one of the most incredible finales you could ask for, even if it was the games were overly ambitious in their design. I think that the finale of Mass Effect is just incredible. So I'd have to pick those two.
But yeah, when it comes to both movies and video games, just comparing them, one thing I always look forward to in movies, just that makes me consider them the better films or some of the best, is I always look for a good storyline and characters that I can get invested in when I watch the movie. Also, when I play the games, and when I play narrative-based games, I always hope I get that same thing. Aside from good gameplay, which is always nice, but I always hope for a good story and characters that I can get attached to as I play throughout the game. And are you kind of the same way when it comes to those types of games and movies?
Yeah. So obviously, you want really good characters. I mean, obviously, with games, gameplay is very, very important. But if you're a narrative-focused game, like a lot of games you'll find on the PlayStation platform, it is very crucial that you actually put a lot of effort into that story narrative-wise. I think the last game that PlayStation really had that was like had me on the edge of my seat while playing during the story was Last of Us Part 2. Just a very well designed story that really is also well translated into the gameplay. That game is honestly, it's hard to put down once you start going in that story. It's incredible. Same thing with like God of War Ragnarok, entertaining from the get-go. And I think there's things you can do in video games that you can't exactly do in a movie, like the fake out in God of War Ragnarok, where you're supposed to fight Thor and you lose and because he kills you in one hit, and then he revives you. That is just like a really brilliant use of narrative and gameplay in a single sequence.
Yeah, and I think another thing when it comes to video games, especially when comparing them against movies, is one thing that a lot of narrative games have that I know some people are really divided on is definitely cutscenes. And I've seen this debated by gamers over the years. There are some people who do enjoy them, but I know that there are others who dislike them. I think one of the reasons why is because I think I've heard that people feel that cutscenes take away from the more enjoying part of the game, which for them is the gameplay. Or some people could argue that games, especially cutscenes, are just trying to rip off movies in that way. For me personally, I don't mind cutscenes. I don't feel like they're trying to rip off movies in a way. It just feels like a piece of the story that isn't playable, which doesn't really take away from the game for me.
I think if you're going to put cutscenes in your game, you need to use them in a very immersive way. Like I'll point out, there's a game, Final Fantasy 16. Every chance it gets to tell you something about its narrative, it rips the controls away from you very abruptly. And I think that it's a good game, but it that's its biggest flaw is it just wants to tell you a story every 5 seconds, and there's no good balance. And I think there's just like this idea that you need to tell your story in a way that like really makes you feel something, and you gotta watch the cinematic masterpiece every time. And I think there's very rarely a game that makes you like actually enjoy like a 20-minute cutscene. Like if you look at the Metal Gear Solid games, they have long cutscenes, but they're very well written, and they're somewhat informative based on like since they're set during the Cold War, and they have a lot of really informative moments, but it's very rare that a game like Metal Gear Solid does a long cutscene well, or you could go the Fallout or Skyrim approach where your character's more immersed into the conversation, where you are a part of it, you're select, like you said, interactive, like you're talking the way you want to talk. That like, and Mass Effect does this too. You can pick a more civilized option when talking to someone, or you could be maybe more dismissive of them or aggressive towards them, and that's always, I think, what people really like in long games with a lot of cutscenes, is having a say in what your character says. Obviously, that's not the only way to do it. I think Last of Us has some really good cinematic cutscenes, but I think the reason why they do it so well is because there's always something happening that's really intense in those games. There's not really any cutscenes in The Last of Us that I would say just kind of drones on with people standing there and talking to each other. Something's always happening.
Yeah, and personally, no, I don't think that the games are trying to rip off the movies in any way. I think both movies and games are different forms of storytelling. And if they can keep you invested and make you feel something as the story plays out, then I think that the writers and the developers have definitely done their jobs correctly.
Yeah, you do, they do need to keep you invested, and I think that's what's tricky about writing for video games as opposed to movies, where you have in a movie or TV show there's one arching narrative, but if you have a game that allows the player, some autonomy in the story, there's so many ifs and ors and different scripts. So if you say this character now has to say this, and how do you keep player autonomy interesting in a cutscene if you don't give them a choice? And that's where I would say, like, people have quick time events where you're reacting to actions that are happening. Like in God of War, you have a lot of events where Kratos needs to kill a thing, but you control when he kills it, and it just makes you feel a part of it. Even though he has to kill the thing, you can't progress the game until you kill that thing. But yeah, I think it blends in that, like I said, it blends in immersion with actual narrative.
Well, yeah, and why don't we dive into some of the movies and games that we wanted to compare and contrast? So, first, I wanted to start off with some of the Batman movies and also some of the games, specifically the Arkham games. So, when it comes to the movies, I mean, some of my favorites are definitely Mask of the Phantasm, The Dark Knight, The Batman. But when it comes to the video games, I think my favorites are definitely the Arkham games, specifically Arkham City. I think that's probably one of my two favorite games of all time. Part of what makes all these my favorites, the movies and the games, is because they each have such great stories to tell. That's one of the reasons why Batman has always been my favorite comic book character. I just always love the deep stories that are built around him, and it's some of my favorites of the superhero genre. Is that the type of experience with Batman that you always look for, not just in the comics, but also in the movies and games?
I always, for Batman, the way he's portrayed in the Arkham games, I think is somewhat unique because the timeline to him being Batman seems to kind of, there was a lot of changes during the development of each game, especially when they slapped in Arkham Origins. What I like about how they structured the Arkham Batman comparative to his Batman the Animated Series counterpart, where Master of the Phantasm takes place, is that this is a Batman who it feels a lot more gritty, in the sense that his villains are a lot more terrifying looking. Like if you look at the Joker in the animated series, he looks a little goofy. And you look at the decrepit looking Joker in the Arkham games, or how horrifying of a character Scarecrow looks. Or how big Killer Croc is. Even the complicated character with like Harvey Dent, they put a lot of detail into his character. Even though they don't do too much with him, but when you play the Arkham games, especially Arkham City, it just feels like, oh, this is what the fictional world of like Gotham is. I think that has a lot to do with their writing, but especially the acting. Kevin Conroy, Mark Hamill, Troy Baker, all those actors who have played their characters before on television got involved with these games, and it just adds to like how incredible the Arkham games are in a narrative standpoint. And that also then will blend into the games, and the guys who are voice acting the thugs who are afraid of Batman, and the more you pick off, the more they start to panic. And I think that just all has to do with how they designed that game, and they knew what they were going to go for.
Yeah, and let's not forget that both Mask of the Phantasm and the first two Arkham games had Paul Dini on the team, who, in my opinion, is one of the better Batman writers.
Right, Paul Dini is great. I think he has just a lot of talent, and I think he's one of those writers who can make anyone interesting. I've read his Zatanna collection, which is just not a superhero a lot of people think about, and he can make Zatanna interesting. I think you give him Batman, you're gonna get a home run every time.
Well, and I think one thing that the games have managed to do a little bit better than the movies is the ability to include so many different villains into the story. I think part of this is because of the fact that games are much, much longer than the movies typically, so they're able to cover a lot more characters and plot threads. However, when I look back at some of the movies, like the Dark Knight trilogy or The Batman, those movies did such a great job incorporating multiple villains into the stories without it feeling overcrowded or anything. Because if you look back, each of those movies had their fair share of villains in the story, but I think what helped was that they all had their own reason for being there. Like they all had their own purpose in that way. And then when you look back at the Arkham games, it kind of does make sense to have all these different villains in it because, it has Arkham in the title. It makes sense to have so many different villains.
Right. So I think in a movie you can only fit so much. Like you take a look at Spider-Man 3, that almost pushes the limit of how many villains you can squeeze into a movie, where I think each Nolan Batman has at least two villains, and that's all you can really fit without it kind of just feeling overbearing, because there's other characters there too, where the Arkham games, especially Arkham City and Arkham Knight, are based in a gigantic map. So to only have each Arkham game center around one villain, or have one villain that you only ever fight, that would be such a letdown. Especially Knight, there's so many enemies, are so many villains in Night, that they even created an expansion called Season of Infamy that added more villains, just added more to Gotham. And so yeah, that's a difference between it being a video game and it being a movie. A movie, you can only, your runtime is probably 2 hours max to be distributed into theaters, so you have to really pick and choose who's going to be the central antagonists of the film. I wouldn't push it past two, where in a game you have just way more freedom, and plus a bigger team to be writing certain storylines. Like you'll probably have a team on the main storyline, but you'll have people writing the side quests. Therefore, there's multiple people focused in a video game, whereas there's only a handful. There's only a smaller team of script writers for a movie, and I think both are kind of different forms of the same art form, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, I totally get what you mean. But yeah, moving on to the next game and movie that we wanted to talk about, well, yeah, because we were just talking about it a few minutes ago, is The Last of Us Part 2, and we were going to compare that to Furiosa. The Last of Us Part 2, looking back at it, is definitely, I think, sort of a complicated game. There were a lot of people who did enjoy it and a lot of people who absolutely hated it. Most people were divided on certain aspects of the story, obviously. Spoiler alert, Joel's death, the fact that the game had us play as Abby after what she had done earlier in the game, and also just the overall plot of the game and how it was kind of structured with how it handled both Ellie and Abby's storylines. So was that ever an issue for you?
No, I think, like, was it, if I was in control, would I have made that narrative choice to kill off Joel? Probably not. I think was kind of definitively the main role. You, as a creative, people are going to take different routes, and if you look at it this way, by the end of Last of Us Part 1, Joel became an irredeemable, violent man who did violent things to people. He basically got what was coming to him, and someone else had their revenge story. And it to say that I would kill Joel off in the beginning of Last of Us 2, or that, I mean, I would have never done that, but that was like all right, well, that kind of sucks, but now we have to kind of experience it the way that Naughty Dog intended, that Neil Druckmann intended. And so you experience Last of Us Part 2, and every moment is something just very interesting. I never really felt bored. Even the times when you're just exploring the decrepit cities with not much in them, they make sure to make everything just really interesting. Like I remember playing it recently, and I found like a stash of scrap to upgrade my weapons, and something not got knocked down, and I look behind me and there's like an affected zombie running towards me, and it jump scares me. And I think that the design of that game and its narrative, it's just moment to moment, just very interesting, and they don't want you to be bored, and they know that they can't afford to let you be bored. So they're always going to make the game interesting, and the characters are talking to each other while you're doing stuff. And that's why I binged Last of Us Part 2. I did not play any other game while I was playing that. I was on my PlayStation for a straight week. And when it was over, and it ends with that scene with Ellie playing her guitar with her now missing fingers, spoiler, and she just stops playing guitar and she kind of looks at the camera and it cuts to black. I just thought that was just, and it makes you sit in silence for a bit. I thought that was just a very artistic way and poetic way to end Last of Us Part 2, because after so much violence and so much intense moments and, experiencing fear, seeing those really messed up abominations of clickers, everything just is calm now and it just makes you sit in silence. And I think it just allows you to process what you just played.
Well, and I can understand why people were disappointed with the storyline. However, what I do respect about the game, The Last of Us Part 2, is how different it is than the first one. This is something that I always look for in sequels in general, not just in movies, but also in games. I always look for I want it to stay true to what the first one was about, but also I hope that it tells a completely different narrative. And, the first one was a lot more like a world-changing mission. The journey was about traveling to produce a cure to save the world, where this one is a lot more of a revenge story. And in a way, it's also a redemption story, also, especially when it comes to Abby. So, yeah, what I do respect and appreciate about The Last of Us Part 2 is how different it is than the first game.
Yeah, I mean, it's completely different in more of the ways than one. So much so that they remade the first game to play a lot closer to the second game. But if we're talking about story, what you had in the first game was you didn't really know anything about the world, obviously, since it was the first entry, and you watch as this man loses his daughter, and he just never really truly recovers from that anger, can hardly still accept his daughter's death, and it translates into this gameplay by the way he fights, the way he acts. Where Last of Us Part 2 is kind of Ellie going through Joel's experience, but instead of doing what he did at the end of Last of Us Part 1, which was effectively doom the world, even though there was no evidence that the cure would work, he still committed an atrocity by murdering these scientists. She had Abby dead to rights at the end of the game, but just was like ultimately just gave up. She thought of all the people, and I know a lot of people don't like that part in the game where it's just like, oh, revenge is bad. I mean, it's a simple thing, but like a simple message, you'll find them in more than one game that are people consider really great. Like all of them have very simple messages at the end, but I think it's just like she loses so many people. Abby loses so many people. Ellie loses a lot of people. One of them just kind of leaves her because she's following a path of vengeance and cannot witness her turn into this kind of evil self, embrace her inner darkness, and she lets go at the end. And I think that's what makes Last of Us Part 2 different than one. It's just the overall where you see a man kind of go embrace his inner darkness at the end and become the epitome of violence. Ellie does the opposite and lets go.
Well, yeah, and moving on to Furiosa. So, what were your thoughts on this movie as both an entry in the Mad Max saga, but also as a prequel for the character of Furiosa? Because this obviously takes place before Mad Max Fury Road. And when comparing it to The Last of Us Part 2, do you think that this movie does a great job staying true to the character of Furiosa? And do you think that it's different enough to make it a standalone from Mad Max Fury Road?
Yeah, I think what works in Furiosa the best is the fact that they introduced a lot of new characters, plus recasting Furiosa and having Anya Taylor-Joy play her instead of Charlize Theron. I think it's because it adds the sense of wonder back into a prequel film to a movie that came out almost or nearly 10 years ago. And because now you're kind of reintroduced into Mad Max again. And I sincerely enjoyed a lot about Furiosa that you wouldn't know in Mad Max Fury Road, other than like she got taken from her homeland and she wanted to go back, and then how she was going to free Immortan Joe's wives. There's a lot more to it in her origin story and the people she met and her claims to fame and how she got to where she was, being able to drive the war rig, and how she lost her arm is actually a really good part in the movie. And I think that, yeah, for an origin story and prequel, I thought it was great. And not to mention, I mean, it's George Miller. It's visually spectacular. There's not one part of the movie where I was bored. I was always just looking at the film, watching it, and I've never felt inspired by a film in a long time. And this one just lit a fire of creativity under me.
Well, and regarding the fact that it is an origin story, one thing that I've noticed about those types of narratives is that they're not always for everyone. There are some people who really enjoy origin stories because they like learning about the characters, but I know that there are some people who consider origin stories kind of boring and unnecessary. And And for me personally, I don't think origin stories are always necessary for every character. Sometimes I think it is better when characters are more of a mystery to the audience. But I think that if they can be explored in a way that really shows us like something we might not have been able to tackle in the first movie as both a sequel or a prequel, then I think that that's worth exploring. And for you as a fan, do you find origin stories really fun, or do you think that they're not always necessary?
It depends. I think it really depends. Like you have Furiosa, most recent example, really fun, really good, and I think that it actually really helped the Mad Max universe as a whole, kind of under adding to it. And there was stuff in Fury Road that I didn't get, like a Morton Joe. I didn't really understand what his deal was. I didn't really understand what was going on, and I feel like you watch Furiosa and it helps better construct the world other than just Furiosa, like especially if you're new to Mad Max, because I didn't watch any Mad Max before Fury Road. So going and seeing Furiosa and meeting all these characters, what feels like for the first time, because even though Morton Joe's the antagonist of Fury Road, he's almost better done in this film and more of a kind of like, okay, I get it. I get why people follow Morton Joe and like how he has come to power in the wasteland, where he kind of just felt like a bad guy in Fury Road. But then you have movies like Solo, which I think is a really good Star Wars movie, but my same criticism always stands. Like, it ultimately did nothing for the Star Wars universe other than introduce a few characters who like pop up at a later time in different Star Wars things. And like, there's stuff like that I have a problem with. And like, that's my same criticism goes to Black Widow and the Obi-Wan TV show. Just like, didn't do anything as a whole. Just kind of was, yeah. And if you, for franchise movies, origin stories, you got to find out exactly what you're telling, and you're not just doing it because fans want to see an Obi-Wan TV show, or we need to get that Black Widow movie out even though we canceled it 5 years ago, but now we should make it. It's like it's too late. Stories progress too far past this point to even warrant an origin.
Yeah, I completely agree. But yeah, moving on to our next movie versus game, we have Fallout versus War for the Planet of the Apes. So the Fallout franchise in general obviously connects to the post-apocalyptic genre. When you look at this franchise and compare it to other games within that genre, and also when you compare it to the movies who have tackled it as well, what about Fallout makes it stand out for you so much from a storytelling perspective?
Fallout allows you to craft your own narrative based on how you talk to people, but also based on how you play. So you could play like a gunslinging cowboy who just lives for the money. But also, when you have to go into quests, you have to pick sides, you have to talk to people. And Fallout, before Fallout 4, operated on the karma system. If you said a mean thing or you performed a violent action to a character in a storyline, you would get bad karma. And if you had bad karma, worse things would happen to you, and you would have maybe more people would be more aggressive towards you, or maybe you even just run into a couple strong enemies who wouldn't be in this area unless you had low karma. But if you did the right thing, the morally high ground thing, you would have to you would get actually rewarded for being good karma. People would take more of a liking to you. Your legend across the wasteland would be better known, and you could be like get better rewards. And I've always thought that the karma system really played into it. But if you play a game like Fallout New Vegas, it even goes deeper, where you can unlock different types of personality traits for your character, and you have a lot more sides to pick. You have you can side with the House, you can side with the NCR, the New California Republic, or Caesar's Legion. There's a million sides to pick in a war for New Vegas. And I think that's why a lot of people love Fallout New Vegas the most, is because it allows for a lot of player autonomy, self-projecting and crafting of your own story in a very well cared for universe, and a very carefully crafted story that allows people to kind of live in an already lived in world. And I think that's what people like. Instead of starting from scratch and watching a world develop, people really like playing a game that feels like people have lived in it and has prior history to before you playing, which I think is what Fallout New Vegas is, why it's so popular amongst Fallout fans.
Well, and obviously, most entries in this franchise are played through first person. So, is this something that you enjoy in narrative driven games, or just in games in general? Because I know that this is an issue that a lot of gamers do have, first person perspective.
I don't think it's a necessity, because you can play Fallout in third person, but it doesn't look as nice. But I don't think it's a necessity. I think it depends on how much meaning it is to the narrative and like how much immersion you want out of it. Because if you look at a game like Mass Effect or Dragon Age, games are all in the third person, but they do a really good way of they allow you to craft your own character, name them. Your companions react to your decisions by maybe they like it, maybe they hate it. Whereas in like a game like Fallout or Cyberpunk, your character is all from the first person's perspective. Where Fallout is your character doesn't have any voice acting for the until Fallout 4. So it's just you hit a response and someone responds back to you. And I think that is what makes the first person perspective in Fallout really, really effective, is because you're like, oh, I said that. That makes me feel like I said that. Where you play in the third person, it's like, oh, the character I'm playing said that. But you take away the camera from behind you and put it in front of you, it adds this layer of immersion that I think a lot of people like better than the third person perspective.
Well, and when it comes to War for the Planet of the Apes, I would argue that this is probably one of the best entries in the entire franchise. And when you compare it to Fallout, is there anything that you think it does better when it relates to that genre, or maybe that you think Fallout does better?
I think so. They're very different apocalypse scenarios, but I think they both share the same idea conceptually, where Fallout is kind of a doomer. Man is doomed to repeat the cycle of violence. No one like Fallout, they'll never get past, like, they nuke themselves into oblivion and they can't get past the cycle of violence. They'll always go to war. Where in War for the Planet of the Apes, Caesar has tried multiple times by that movie to negotiate peace with humans. And even at the beginning of that movie, he spares the lives of these soldiers who came to kill him. And as I think it'd be like to show that we were peaceful, but instead they come back, they kill his wife and son are killed, and it starts, it continues the war between humans and man. And I think that also is like a message about how man's going to be doomed to repeat a cycle of violence, where I think one of them where War for the Planet of the Apes might have a brighter outlook on life at the end, where it's just like, even if man's gone, there'll be someone to kind of take man's place in probably and save the world, which is kind of what the ending felt like to me. It still had that message of like the cycle of violence will continue until someone stops it, and that's what Fallout is kind of.
Yeah, I agree. But next up, we are moving on to Spider-Man 3 versus Marvel's Spider-Man 2 by Insomniac. So I wanted to talk about this because we had just mentioned it earlier. Both Spider-Man 3 and Marvel's Spider-Man 2 tackled the Venom symbiote storyline. So first up, with Spider-Man 3, that movie spent most of the time focusing on Peter being bonded to the black suit, only for Venom to really become a threat during the third act of the movie. This is obviously one of the biggest complaints that the movie faced at the time and still does to this day. That and the fact that the movie had so many different villains and storylines. Aside from Venom, there's also Sandman and there's Harry Osborn, who becomes the new Green Goblin. And I think the issue was that they were trying to balance too many different ideas with the Venom symbiote storyline. And in the end, it all just got really overcrowded. Ultimately, I think the Venom arc is a little too big for just one movie.
Yeah, so I don't think Sam Raimi wanted Venom.
He did not. No, no.
I think Sony made him put Venom in because it was just popular. Like, you have to have Venom. He's the antithesis to Spider-Man, He's everything that Spider-Man is not. But if you don't have the knowledge of Venom and then you're just putting them there because you're told to put them there, you get the Sam Raimi Venom, which is just, I think the difference, if you're asking, between the game version from the game last year versus the Sam Raimi version, is its passion versus reluctance. The people who made the Venom in Spider-Man 2 on the PlayStation 5, a lot of passionate folks wrote on that character and worked on him and understood Venom, where Sam Raimi was reluctant to even have this character here. And he tried his best with it, but it's probably the worst interpretation of the symbiote. But we got what we got, and I think like Sony should just to kind of let him focus on the Sandman story, because if you take out the Venom stuff and you watch the Sandman parts of Spider-Man 3, that movie is way more interesting.
Well, and when you look at Marvel's Spider-Man 2, like we were just saying, that also included the Venom storyline as one of their main arcs in the story. So, although the game was really successful, One complaint that I did hear from some people was that they felt we didn't spend enough time with Peter when he was bonded to the symbiote. And I can understand what they're saying, but overall, I did like how it was executed. I thought Yuri Lowenthal did an incredible job in his performance as well. I did like seeing Peter sort of descend into darkness in that part. And do I think it would have been cool if we spent a little bit more time with that side of Peter? Maybe, but I don't really think it was that big of a deal. And well, aside from the Venom symbiote, this was also a game where they had another big storyline going on with the character of Kraven as he came to New York City to hunt down all the superpowered people. So, that was another big storyline that also needed a good amount of time to be fleshed out.
Yeah, I think why people might have had that complaint is you upfront before any sale price, that is a $70 game that is ultimately 25 hours of gameplay, 30 if you do everything. And I think that's where people feel a little ripped off and why they were like, I wish this was longer. And the game admittedly does feel rushed. There's a lot of stuff that was cut from that game. But like you said, Yuri Lowenthal's performance is great. And I think he's a great voice actor, and you can see his work and other stuff. Like, he's also very famously known for Naruto, for playing Sasuke, who is a darker character. Ben 10, he's just a great actor. He plays Spider-Man really well. And to see him finally kind of do the symbiote arc, it's great. And I think that like he did the best. Like, what they did here is something that you forget about the symbiote arc, because I think people take it a little bit too seriously sometimes, is that he just says things that are really uncalled for and really ridiculous to people, like really mean, but like almost like like schoolyard bullying stuff. And you're like, no, if you go back and read some old symbiote arcs, like it happens every once in a while. Like, he says things that are just like way out of pocket. And I think that Yuri Lowenthal did that really well. And I also love how he gets the suit. It stops him from dying instead of he just gets the suit because the fact that he's more attached to it because it saved his life. I think that makes it put the stakes up way higher. I think like, oh, that's why he really likes it. Like, he got Craven stabs him fatally, and the symbiote got on him and saved him from dying. And that's why he's got this attachment. And I like that way better than just being attached to the suit because it makes me strong. Which he does also like that part. He does say like, oh, it makes me stronger, it makes me the Spider-Man I need to be. It also saved his life. So there's more from a player perspective. You can understand why the symbiote works so well in that game.
Moving on to our final game versus movie discussion, we have Elden Ring versus Fellowship of the Ring. So before we really dive into this game and the movie, here's one thing that I did want to touch on. So obviously, one of the best things about Lord of the Rings in general is the story that it has to tell over all three films, not just the first one. But regarding Elden Ring, one thing that I've seen people debate online from time to time is that the game doesn't really have a story to tell. Is that something that you agree with?
No, I don't think that Elden Ring doesn't have a story to tell. Elden Ring is a story that, as a player, you have to discover. So there's not cutscenes and cutscenes. There are characters who provide some monologues. You have to kind of find some characters who provide story to you. Like, a very good story is the story of Dialos and his family, and in his dealings with this murderous cult of people who follow one of the Elden Lords, who is a snake man. There are contextual items that you can find. Like, if you find a piece of gear in that game, it has like this gauntlet you found, it has a story behind it. The sword you found has a story behind it. What you're doing in a way is you're kind of like a historian in Elden Ring. You're finding out what happened to the lands between before you arrived, because you play as the Tarnished. They're not from this kingdom. They have been guided here by the Grace, which is the little yellow lights you follow out throughout the game, and they're seeking to fulfill the prophecy of becoming an Elden Lord, because the prophecy says that a Tarnished will one day become Elden Lord and mend the Elden Ring. And as you're going through the game, you're finding out about this Golden Order, basically a family tree that has kind of just, they went to war with each other over power. The thing about the Elden Ring and FromSoft, who makes the games, they're a lot about indirect storytelling, environmental storytelling. You get the idea of what happened by exploring, where Fellowship of the Ring, you have to be told this stuff in a matter of time, where Elden Ring is like putting a puzzle together.
Well, and when comparing Elden Ring to Lord of the Rings, specifically Fellowship of the Ring, like we said, one thing that they have in common is they're obviously both part of the fantasy genre. And is that a genre that you're a big fan of? And also, when you look back at both the movie and the game, is there anything that stands out for you in particular from a story perspective when it comes to the fantasy genre?
I really like fantasy games. One of my favorite games of all time is Elder Scrolls Oblivion for a lot of different reasons that are not the story. But yeah, so with the standouts between the Fellowship in the Ring and Elden Ring, is Fellowship of the Ring is an adaptation of a well-beloved book that has a lot of backstory, which Elden Ring also has. And they both share that similarity. The only thing is Elden Ring's a video game that has almost endless amounts of time for you to figure out the backstory. Where Fellowship of the Ring is a book slash a movie, where a book can have more time to tell you things. A movie, once again, has a limited runtime to get you all the information you need. Therefore, Fellowship of the Ring is carried by a lot of acting performances and set design and set work and visuals. And I think that's also what stands out in Elden Ring, other than from its gameplay, which is what people play those games for, is it's really hard difficulty and fun bosses, is like you're going into decrepit castles, battlefields that have been plagued by disease, frozen wastelands, and it really wows you because you're just like, how can one game have so much detail in it? And the same thing with Lord of the Rings is Fellowship of the Ring is like, it's a movie, but there's a lot of detail. There's, they go to the Hobbiton, they go to Isengard, they fall into a decrepit cavern and they fight an ogre down there, and there's skeletons everywhere. Like, the attention to detail in both these projects are amazing. And I think that's why I find them so similar.
Well, and one thing that makes the story of Lord of the Rings so great and I think enthralling as well is definitely the sort of grand scale of it all, and also just kind of the thrill of being in an adventure as you follow these characters. So that's definitely one thing that's cool. So when you look at Elden Ring, what about it makes it so majestic and thrilling for you? Is it just the overall gameplay, or do you think also the fact that it is an open world game really adds to that?
I think the open world really adds to that, but I think that the fact that they slap really hard fights in front of progression, which makes it more interesting. Because the thing about Elden Ring and the games from its genre, like Dark Souls, is the want to keep exploring. But when you put an enemy in the way that must be defeated to continue exploring, and that guy's really hard, the sense of wonder can be overtaken by a sense of defeat, and you're like, oh, this guy's so hard, I can't do it. But you're like, I have to see what's coming next, or at least that's what I really love about playing those games for the first time when there's a new one. It's like, I need to see the next area. I can't. So it motivates you to defeat that tough enemy, that boss, and you defeat it, and you, on the other side, you see this new area that is like, whoa, what, this is incredible. And I think that's what I really love about those games, is that the design of the open world is so beautiful and so great and fun to explore that it motivates you to keep playing.
Yeah, and I think one thing that can always be appreciated about the fantasy genre in general is just the ambition and imagination to it. And this is something that definitely applies to both Elden Ring and Lord of the Rings in general. So when you look back at both the game and the movie, are there certain elements of that that you think one explored better than the other?
Yeah, I think Lord of the Rings has obviously better character work. You care about these characters more, and the sense of just like the Dark Lord Sauron and like in the creation of the rings. I specifically really like the idea of like Aragorn and how he's a part of the Rangers. There's just so many different factions and ideas, but the best thing is just the character work, how they bond with each other, how they talk to each other. Even like if you look, like Saruman gets called out by an orc in I think Fellowship by basically saying like, you were expecting too much orcs. You have to lower your expectations. I can't make that many orcs. And I think that's a great moment in that movie because it just adds better detail to like who's the type of guy Saruman is, and even if you don't understand fantasy, I think that kind of, in my way, from working a lot, you're like, Saruman's is a crappy boss to have. Where Elden Ring, they have good character work, but you have to seek it out. You're not going to get it right away. You'll meet characters in Elden Ring who lead very mysterious quests or lives, but you have to keep finding them in different parts of the map. So unless you're someone who really likes exploring, you're not going to get that character work. But what I think Elden Ring does really well is the implications of like, what's a threat, because Elden Ring has to do that by design. Where in the movies, Lord of the Rings movies, they have to imply that Sauron's powerful and they just make him big. But you don't really see him do much other than like he kills a few people with a mace instantly. Once again, limited amount of time to show that something's powerful.
Yeah, I agree. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening. Max, thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. All right, guys. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you later.